Chapter 1. The Path to Power, Part 1. The German Labour Party was founded in Munich in January 1919. In July of that year, Adolf Hitler, at that time education officer in the Reichswehr, joined this party. He was the seventh member of what later developed into the National Socialist German Labour Party. Who were the founders and first members of this party? From what sections of the population did they come, and what interests did they represent? In the first place, they consisted of soldiers and officers who had come back from the war completely disillusioned. For 4 years they had honestly believed in the chauvinistic slogans with which they had been fed. They had staked their lives in the struggle for a greater Germany. They believed in the legend that pacifist and social democratic traitors had stabbed the German army in the back and brought about its defeat. These men who came back were deeply embittered by what they thought was the weakness of the ruling class, the treachery and flight of the Kaiser and of the deposed princes, and the failure of the generals of the Great War to strike down the November criminals. These deeply disillusioned soldiers and officers could no longer find a place for themselves in civil life. To a great extent, the professions which they had once practiced now no longer existed. This was true particularly of the professional soldiers, military cadets, and a number of categories of officials. They were joined by members of the uprooted nobility, students who had been torn from their studies by the war, and declassed and radicalized members of the middle classes, who now began to feel the ground giving way under their feet. All of these elements, who at that time also flocked into the many other military bodies which arose at that time, the Einwohnerwehr, the Stahlhelm, and the Erhard Brigade, formed the first basis of the Young National Socialist German Labour Association, as the party first called itself officially. For 2 years after its formation, the National Socialists were quite an insignificant group. The November Revolution of 1918 had been beaten down, and the capitalist system had got a new lease of life. The Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert became the first president of the Weimar Republic. The old forces of finance capitalism consolidated their rule again. The trade union leaders had concluded an agreement with the employers, based on negotiations in November 1918 between Hugo Stinnes and the president of the General Committee of the Trade Unions, the Social Democrat Karl Legien. What at that time could Hitler do for the leading groups of German capitalists? At that period they were not yet in need of the National Socialists. Hitler's association therefore remained without any significance. He himself continued in the service of the Reichswehr until April 1920, giving political lectures to the soldiers. On instructions from the Reichswehr, he also observed political organizations and meetings, bringing in reports and information. This was how Hitler first came into contact with the German Labour Party. Not long afterwards, the political importance of the party began to grow. The political situation in Germany began to change rapidly under the effect of the dictated Peace of Versailles and the losses of the war. Milliards of marks were demanded in reparations and had to be paid. Important industrial areas were lopped off. Alsace-Lorraine, Upper Silesia, the Saar territory, Posen and West Prussia, the so-called Polish corridor, Danzig and Eugen-Malmedy. The German market was still further restricted by the loss of a considerable portion of its European and oversea connections, in addition to the German colonies. The cost of demobilization and of putting the war industries onto a peace basis was a terrific burden on the smaller taxpayers, as the dominant circles of German monopoly capital were continuously devising new methods of transferring the reparations payments and all other losses onto the shoulders of the workers and the middle class. This development reached its highest point in the inflation which had begun during the war, but was only widely felt among the population in the course of 1921 and 1922. In the autumn of 1923 it reached the point of catastrophe. It had brought about still further impoverishment of the workers, and had transformed a considerable section of the middle classes into proletarians. Millions of the poorer sections of the middle class were literally robbed of everything they had by the inflation. The State paid the banks and heavy industry concerns 600 million gold marks as compensation for the occupation of the Ruhr by the French, and these concerns also made enormous profits. The economic chaos produced far-reaching political disturbances. Erzberger and Rathenau fell victims to the bullets of nationalist murderers. Among the working class a process of radicalization was taking place. The Spartacus struggles in Berlin in January 1919 were followed by the rising of the workers in the Ruhr during the Kapp Putsch of March 1920 and the workers' revolt in March 1921. The workers began to leave the social democratic organizations, making their way first to the independent Social Democrats, then, after the autumn of 1920, to the Communist Party. Great demonstrations culminated in the Hamburg Rising of October 1923. The 25 points of the Nazi program. In 1920, the National Socialist German Labour Party first began to develop importance. In February of that year, Hitler himself, at a meeting in Munich, put forward the program of the party, the so-called 25 points. These are a hash of theses and demands, which in parts are self-contradictory. The political practice of the Nazi Party has at no time followed the principles laid down in the 25 points, nor did it matter to Hitler and his vassals that at the end of the programme the following passage occurs: "The leaders of the party undertake, if necessary at the risk of their own lives, to work unceasingly for the carrying through of the points enumerated above." This was not the only promise which the Nazi leaders gave and failed to keep. In a general meeting of the party in May 1926, a resolution was once again adopted stressing the unalterable character of the party's programme. Gottfried Feder, the joint author of the 25 points and theoretician of the party, in his commentary on the programme, laid stress on the fact that there must be no tampering with the basis and fundamental conceptions of this programme. There must be no twisting and turning on any opportunistic grounds. There must be no hide and seek with the present state, economic and social order of things, and there must be no weakening of our principles. Those who in the Jewish question, in our fight against high finance, against the Dawes Pact and the policy of impoverishing Germany, or in any other questions on our programme, cannot see eye to eye with the irrevocable aims and methods which we have laid down. Those who believe that the freedom of the German nation can be bought through the League of Nations or Locarno by compromise and cowardice, such people need have nothing to do with us. Let them remain outside of our party. But all these magnificent words cannot hide the fact that the National Socialist leaders have repeatedly repudiated and betrayed their own half-hearted and compromising programme. Their treachery to their programme begins with the first 2 points. Point 1. The union of all Germans on the basis of the right of self-determination of peoples to form a greater Germany. Point 2. The equal right of the German nation with all other nations, and the cancellation of the peace treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain. Neither of these 2 points in his programme prevented Hitler, both before and after his seizure of power, from concluding compromises with the signatories of the Versailles Treaty and sending envoys to negotiate with the League of Nations, France, Poland, England and Italy. Nor did either of these points make him hesitate to betray the South Tyrol to Mussolini. In the first edition of Feder's commentary on the programme, the following passage occurs: "We shall not give up a single German in South Germany, in Alsace-Lorraine, in the South Tyrol, in Poland, in Austria, the colony of the League of Nations, and the succession states of what was formerly Austria. In the second and all later editions the words "in the South Tyrol" were omitted. It may be noted in passing that in his foreword to the fifth edition Feder remarks, "The only alterations which have been made are in the case of a few stylistic expressions and passages which might have led to misunderstanding." It is the same with other points of the programme, particularly the demands of an economic and social character, such as the abolition of income derived without labour and effort, abolition of the dominion of interest, point 11, the complete confiscation of all war profits, point 12, the taking over by the state of all concerns which have already been trustified, point 13, participation in the profits of large concerns, point 14, a considerable extension of provision for old age, point 15, the creation and maintenance of a healthy middle class, the immediate municipalization of the large stores and the leasing of them at low prices to small tradespeople, close control of all small tradespeople in their sales to the Reich, to the constituent states of the Reich, or to the local authorities. Point 16. Land reform suited to our national needs, the establishment of legislation to provide for expropriation of land without compensation where required for public purposes, abolition of the land tax, and measures to prevent speculation in land. Point 17. It is not necessary to examine each of these points in the programme in detail. Some of them will be dealt with in later chapters, as for example the points relating to the Jewish question, points 4 through 8 and 23. At this stage we are concerned only with indicating the general basis of the National Socialist programme and with showing how the leaders of the National Socialist Party have unscrupulously betrayed their own programme. The demands themselves are in part reactionary lower middle class demands, as for example, the creation and maintenance of a healthy middle class. Here too we have half-heartedness and contradiction, such as is characteristic of the programme throughout. For how is the middle class to be maintained if the capitalist economic system, which necessarily destroys the middle class and brings them into the ranks of the working class, is also to be maintained? This is also true of the point dealing with agrarian policy. How can Hitler save the peasantry if he maintains private property intact, if he repudiates any expropriation of the big landlords in favour of the landless peasant? In April 1928 Hitler expressly stated that the National Socialist Party was determined to protect the private ownership of the means of production with all the strength it could command. In an explanation of the phrase expropriation without compensation in point 17 of his programme, he stated that this only referred to legislation authorizing the expropriation where necessary of land which was not being properly used from the standpoint of the welfare of the people, and that this passage was in the first place directed against Jewish land speculation companies. On the other hand, the National Socialist programme also contained demands which had previously been the stock in trade of liberal parties, and also demands embodied in the Weimar Constitution. Point 13, the taking over of the trusts by the state, is stolen straight out of the programme of the German Democratic Party of 1919. Other points are unfulfilled promises made in the Weimar Constitution. Examples of this are point 15, extension of provision for old age, point 20, full opportunities for ability. Compare with the Constitution and the Welfare Act of 1924, point 21, improvement of the health of the people and protection for mother and child, and point 24, public service before private interest. Compare paragraph 156 of the Constitution. The growth of the Nazi movement. Hitler appeared in the first great meetings organized by the Nationalist Socialist Party to put forward this programme. At that period, the agitation against the Versailles Treaty was put in the forefront of the Nazi agitation. The more the middle class was affected by the continuous inflation, the more popular the Nazi demonstrations became. It cannot, however, be disputed that in the middle class it was not only the material losses they suffered through reparations, inflation, and the occupation of the Ruhr which affected their outlook, but also the blow to national sentiment which was inflicted by the dictated Peace of Versailles and the entry of French troops into German territory. In February 1921, soon after the reparations negotiations, a great National Socialist demonstration was held in Munich with the slogan, "Germany's future or extinction." For the first time motors carrying swastika flags passed through the streets of Munich advertising the demonstration. Posters were put up everywhere with the demagogic text, "If 60 million Germans, young and old, declare their united determination, we will not pay. Then the will of these millions will at least secure the respect which is not given to those who kiss the lash which whips them. We are men, not dogs. The 60 million Germans must tell the government clearly that whoever negotiates will be overthrown." This demonstration was a great success for Hitler. The national parties and associations which had been using old pre-war methods of propaganda ridiculed the young man when he came to them proposing the organization of giant demonstrations against the government's policy of fulfilment, and still more when on their refusal he himself undertook the task with his own tiny party. But the programme of the nationalist parties, which was that of the Junkers and big capitalists, was not suitable for the middle classes, who, however, were carried away by the 25 points and Hitler's unscrupulous agitation. The failure of the Kapp Putsch had shown the weakness of the Junkers. The Putsch was based on the support of the big landlords and parts of the Reichswehr and the higher grades of the civil service, besides a few military groups. But it was completely out of touch with the discontent in the middle class. It was therefore beaten by the working class within 24 hours. The Stahlhelm, too, could never win more than a very limited influence, chiefly among peasant and urban youth and the most backward sections of the workers, members of the yellow unions and agricultural labourers. But the National Socialists were different. They put forward their imaginary fight against international Jewish banking and speculative capital, and their slogan of the National Union, in which all sections of the population would live at peace with each other under a strong state, and with this programme they were able to penetrate widely different groups, including large numbers of the middle class. In 1921 the membership of the National Socialist Party grew from 3,000 to 6,000, but its sphere of influence at that time was almost exclusively limited to Bavaria. In North Germany the movements under Graefe, Wülle, Henning and Count Reventlow were very much stronger. In 1920 the first Congress of the National Socialist Party was held in Salzburg. This Congress was attended by members of the Austrian National Socialist Party, which dated from before the war. It had been formed in 1904 as a German Labour Party, and in May 1918 this joined with other groups to form the National Socialist Party of Austria. National Socialism dates, therefore, from the early years of the century. It developed first in Bohemia, where the national question played a particularly important role. Hitler, an Austrian by birth, had taken a great deal from their programme, but he was unable to reach an agreement at Salzburg with Jung, the leader of the Bohemian Party. The next Congress was held at Reichenhall in 1921. This Congress was held jointly with Russian and Ukrainian White Guard associations. Hetman Skoropadsky was among the speakers, in conjunction with the National Socialist Alfred Rosenberg, whose family came from the Baltic provinces and who later became editor of the Völkischer Beobachter and Nazi expert in foreign politics. The White Guard emigrants developed their plans of intervention against the Soviet state, which had just driven out the last of the troops of intervention. Already at that period Rosenberg had developed connections with Deterding and the German industrial employer Reichstag, both of them violently hostile to the Soviet Union. It is interesting to note that in the Völkischer Beobachter Rosenberg writes his first anti-Bolshevik articles, which were pro-Polish. In a manifesto issued in connection with the Congress of the party in Munich in January 1922, Hitler, who had still to win his position as sole dictator of the Nazi party, stated that it was necessary to purge the movement, as it had become a breeding ground for well-meaning fools, who were all the more dangerous because of their good intentions. This was evidently directed against the other founders of the party, including Anton Drexler and Körner, who were not prepared to follow Hitler in his new and unscrupulous methods. High and influential officers in the Reichswehr at Munich had for a considerable time given support to the movement. Among them were some of Hitler's former colleagues of 1919 and 1920. With their help, he set up, alongside of the party organization proper and the press and propaganda department, a third organization, which in the following years and later on served as his main fighting weapon, the Storm Troops. In the summer of 1920, the National Socialist Party, under the pretext of protecting their meetings against attacks by the Reds, had set up what they called a corps for maintaining order. But this was too small and weak for Hitler, who in August 1921 set up his own protective organization, the Storm Troops. These formed the terrorist section of the National Socialist Party, and were brought directly under the political leadership of the party. Who financed Hitler? Not long after this period, a number of capitalists, particularly in South Germany, began to take an interest in Hitler and the National Socialist Party, with a view to drawing them in to support their own reactionary politics. They realized the value of the National Socialist movement as a weapon against the militant sections of the working class, and they were therefore prepared to support the Nazis, particularly with finance. In the Hitler-Ludendorff trial of 1924, it was proved that Hitler had received considerable sums of money for his party from Aust, the director of the Bavarian Employers' Association. Bechstein, the piano manufacturer, Maffei, an industrial employer in Munich, and Hornschuh of Kulmbach, and Grandl of Augsburg, two manufacturers. Hitler also gave lectures on his aims in the select clubs of bankers, landlords, and big employers of labor. In return, he received contributions in support of the National Socialist press and for similar purposes. Hitler also received subsidies from Borsig, a large industrial employer of Berlin, who was chairman of the Union of German Employers' Associations. An agent of Hitler's in Switzerland, Dr. Gausser, is also said to have secured for Hitler finance from Henry Ford, and also from French capitalist groups who were speculating on the Bavarian separatist movement. It is probable that the full sources of Hitler's finance will only become known when the archives come into the hands of the German workers. But political proof of the source of his finance is already clear. The whole policy of the National Socialist Party and the declarations of sympathy for it made by important capitalist groups such as Thyssen and Schacht are proof of the great interest necessarily taken in the Hitler movement by the ruling class. Hitler's debts and the immense expenditure on propaganda and for the maintenance of the storm troops were factors which played a certain role in bringing him into action in 1923. The Putsch of November 9th, 1923. The Munich Putsch of November 9th, 1923, was the highest point and also the end of the first upward movement of the National Socialist Party. All through 1923, Hitler had been urging his allies in the Bavarian government and the Reichswehr to take action. Early in November he mobilized the fighting associations, and in a great demonstration of patriotic associations in Munich announced the formation of the National Republic. He announced the deposition of Ebert, appointed himself Chancellor, Kahr his vice-consul for Bavaria, Pöhner, the chief of the Munich police prime minister, and Ludendorff, minister of the Reichswehr. The Bavarian ministers were arrested but released by Ludendorff a few hours later on parole. At first Kahr supported Hitler's proposals, but in the evening went with General von Lossow and General Seisser to the barracks of the 19th Infantry Regiment, from which they declared in a broadcast that they repudiated the Hitler Putsch. Kahr stated that his consent had been obtained from him by the threat of force. He also announced the compulsory liquidation of the National Socialist German Labour Party, as well as the fighting associations Oberland and Reichsflagge. This report and the order for the dissolution of these organizations was published in the Munich papers on November 9th. Hitler and Ludendorff made a despairing effort to take power, although Hitler had given his word of honour a few months earlier to the Bavarian Minister of the Interior that he would not make any attempt at a putsch. They marched with their fighting organizations through the streets. The Reichswehr maintained an attitude of neutrality. It would not fire on the marching troops. Bavarian police awaited Hitler's approach in one of the public buildings. The police fired one volley. 15 of the Hitlerites fell dead. Hitler himself fled and was arrested in the villa of a princess before he was able to cross the Austrian frontier. Göring fled to Italy and later to Sweden. Ludendorff was not arrested. The trial of the Putschists of November 9th took place in the spring of 1924. The judges were merciful and sympathetic, for the accused were nationally minded people who had acted with the best intentions. The accused were Hitler, Field Marshal von Ludendorff, Frick, a police official who was to become Minister of the Interior in 1933, Captain Röhm, Lieutenant Pernet, Ludendorff's stepson, and a few others. Nazi historians record that the accused were in cheerful mood and were smiling and cracking jokes. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years' detention in a fortress, subject to being released on parole when he had served a portion of the sentence. A few months later, in December 1924, he was released from the Landsberg fortress. Röhm, Frick, and Brückner got away with only 3 months' detention. Ludendorff was released without punishment on the ground that he had been carried away in the excitement of the moment. Hitler, then still an Austrian citizen, was not expelled, but was allowed to continue to reside in Germany. The Nazis disappear from the scene. The failure of the 1923 Putsch formed the close of the insurrectionary period of the Hitler movement. The time of plans for armed uprisings against the Jewish government in Berlin had now passed. The German economic situation had reached a certain stability, and the position of the middle class was improving. Hence, for some years, the National Socialist Party virtually disappeared from the scene. The United People's and National Socialist parties, which in the Reichstag elections of May 1924 had obtained 1,900,000 votes and 32 seats, in December of that year secured only 840,000 votes and 14 seats. They sank down among the splinter parties, while the German Nationals secured over 100 and the Social Democrats 120 seats. The following years were marked by internal struggles within the Nationalist and National Socialist parties. In the summer of 1925, the German People's Freedom Party split, and a large section of its former supporters went over to Hitler. In the meanwhile, the employers continued to take back from the workers the concessions they had won in 1918. In January 1925, a government was formed of the reactionary parties under the leadership of the German Nationalists. 3 months later, Field Marshal von Hindenburg was elected, by the combined forces of the right to succeed Ebert as President of the Reich. The National Socialists, who in the first ballot had supported the hopeless candidature of Ludendorff, in the second ballot voted for Hindenburg. This was the beginning of the transformation of the National Socialist movement. The Nazis support the princes. In 1926, in connection with the referendum for the expropriation of the princes, the National Socialists joined the chorus of all the reactionary parties, from the German Nationalists to the Centre and the Democrats, in shouting, "The expropriation of the princes is robbery of well-earned wealth." Moreover, the Nazis have never changed their line in connection with this question. The leader of the Nazi fraction in the Reichstag declared, in connection with a communist motion for the expropriation of the princes and the discontinuance of payments to the Kaiser and the nobility, "A sense of justice makes us reject the communist motion for the expropriation of the princes. German Socialism must also recognize the rights of the Hohenzollerns." The German princes and former nobility have rewarded the Nazis for this attitude by putting millions of their compensation money at the disposal of the Nazis. We refer particularly to Prince August Wilhelm, son of the ex-Kaiser, Duke Karl Eduard of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Prince Wilhelm von Hessen, whom Göring appointed President of Hesse-Nassau in 1933, Prince Christian of Schaumburg-Lippe, and recently the former Crown Prince has joined the motor corps of the Nazis. The National Socialists have not been in a position to deny that the ex-Kaiser Wilhelm II has also helped in the financing of the storm troops. Hitler then tried the policy of drawing closer to the reactionary parties in order to win back the confidence of the capitalists, which he had lost through the Munich Putsch. He attempted to win legal positions because he realized that this was the only way to win the favour and support of the ruling class. Once again he began lecturing in the employers' clubs, in order to persuade the big capitalists that his ideas were not at all dangerous, and to explain to them how much better they could work with the National Socialists than with the unpatriotic Social Democrats. But now the leader did not restrict his activities to South Germany. He went to the western areas to find the industrial barons in their citadels. In 1926 he spoke twice to specially invited audiences in Essen and Königswinter, and again in 1927 at the Krupp Hall in Essen. The organ of heavy industry, the Rheinisch-Westfälische Zeitung, records the applause with which Hitler's remarks were greeted. End of Chapter 1, Part 1. Chapter 1. The Path to Power, Part 2. Strasser and Goebbels speak of socialism. In the same period, and this is typical of the double-faced, unscrupulous propaganda of the National Socialists, Gregor Strasser, one of Hitler's lieutenants, toured through North and East Germany with socialist slogans of the German Revolution. At that time also Joseph Goebbels comes on the stage. He was a young Catholic writer from the Rhineland. In October 1925, Strasser started the National Socialist Correspondence, which became, as it were, the theoretical organ of the left National Socialists. Goebbels, at first editor of this journal, then went in 1926 to Berlin as district leader. Up to then the movement had made little headway there. From July 1927 he published a weekly called Der Angriff, with the pseudo-socialist mottos, "For the oppressed, against the exploiters." Gregor Strasser, with his brother Otto, formerly a Social Democrat, started a small press in Berlin, the Kampfverlag. It produced 3 daily papers, the Nationaler Sozialist, NS, in Berlin, the Märkische Beobachter for the Brandenburg province, and the Sächsischer Beobachter. At that time these were the only Nazi daily newspapers in central and northern Germany. The Kampfverlag, also published 3 weekly papers and a number of books and pamphlets. There is no doubt that at that period Gregor Strasser attempted to rival Hitler in North Germany. He had certain differences with Hitler, and only made these up later. But he continued to carry out an independent policy, and eventually, at the end of 1932, Hitler relieved him of his functions when he had become too closely associated with General Schleicher. In all the publications of the Kampfverlag, a very radical tone was used, which was intended to make the reader believe that he was being spoken to by a friend of the workers and even a class fighter. National or International Socialism, a pamphlet published by the Kampfverlag, asserted that the National Socialist Party is the class party of creative labour. The author of this pamphlet was Jung, first president of the Austrian Nazis. Gregor Strasser's motto was freedom and bread, and his trademark is a hammer and sword. Goebbels uses the same tactics in his pamphlet, The Nazi Sozi, Questions and Answers for Nationalists. There can surely be nothing more hypocritical than a fat, well-fed capitalist who protests against the proletarian idea of class struggle, who gave you the right to throw out your chest, swollen with national responsibility, in indignation against the class struggle of the proletariat. Has not the capitalist state for some 60 years been an organized class state, which brought with it as an inevitable historical necessity the proletarian idea of class struggle? Are you not ashamed, you well-fed Central European, to fight the class fight against underfed, hollow-eyed, hungry, workless proletarians? Yes, we call ourselves the worker state. This is the first step away from the capitalist state. We call ourselves a labor party because we want to set labor free, because to us creative labor is the progressive element in history, because labor means more to us than property, education, rank, and bourgeois origin. This is why we call ourselves a labor party. We call ourselves socialist as a protest against the lie of capitalist social compassion. We want no compassion. We want no social outlook. We despise the rubbish which you call social legislation. It is too little to live with and too much to die with. We demand a full share of what heaven gave us and what we create with our hands and our brains. That is socialism. We protest against the idea of the class struggle. Our whole movement is one great protest against the class struggle. But at the same time, we call things by their right names. If on one side 17 million proletarians see their only salvation in the class struggle, this is because from the right side they have been taught this in practice for 60 years. How can we find any moral justification in fighting against the class struggle unless the capitalist class state is first absolutely torn in shreds and abolished through a new socialist organization of the German people? These words were written not so very long ago by the man who later became Reich Minister for Enlightenment and Propaganda. It is quite a different tone from that used in the 25 points, in which the word socialism does not occur. Compare Goebbels' demand for the tearing in shreds of the capitalist class state with the official organ of the Nazi Party, which in point 25 says, "For the carrying through of the above, the whole programme, we demand the creation of a strong central power in the Reich, the absolute authority of the central political parliament over the whole Reich and all its organizations, the formation of chambers of trades and professions for the carrying through in the separate states of the Reich of the general measures laid down by the Reich." By the side of the policy as put forward by Goebbels, the Hitler programme of 1920 seems colourless, conventional, philistine, and liberal. Goebbels' manifesto against the fat, well-fed capitalist provides a fascist programme which is much more suitable for industrial areas than the 25 points of Hitler. New defeats in 1928. Nevertheless, neither Hitler with his lectures to the well-fed capitalists of the Rhineland and the Ruhr, nor Strasser and Goebbels with their demagogy, could succeed in extending the mass influence of the National Socialist Party. It is true that a certain internal consolidation of the party took place during this period. The membership rose from 17,000 in 1926 to 40,000 in 1927. Two congresses were held, Weimar in 1926 and Nürnberg in 1927. The storm detachments were re-established. The party got rid of well-meaning, but for that reason all the more dangerous fools. The racial specialist, Dinter in Thuringia, was among those expelled. Moreover, in order to make the party presentable in drawing-rooms, the infamous murderer Heines was expelled, although his bloody record did not prevent Hitler from taking him back again later and appointing him police president of Breslau and head of the storm detachments of the whole of North and East Germany. In May 1928, the National Socialist Party again suffered a heavy defeat at the polls, securing only 12 seats in the Reichstag. The objective situation for the growth of the Fascist movement had not yet developed. The years 1924 to 1927 had brought a certain restoration of Germany's economic life, and this had resulted in easier conditions for the middle class generally, and also for some sections of the working class. The economic crisis in Germany. The illusory economic prosperity, however, reached its zenith. Germany was the first European country to be affected by the developing world crisis. Production fell and unemployment rose. In the winter of 1930 there were already over 3 million unemployed in Germany. The employers began a general attack on wages. According to estimates made by the Berlin Finanzpolitische Korrespondenz, the average weekly wages of industrial workers fell as follows. In the summer of 1929 they were 44.60 Reichsmarks. In March 1930, 39.05 Reichsmarks. The average weekly wage throughout the year, which in 1928 and 1929 was 42 and 45 marks, fell to 37 marks in 1930 and 30 marks in 1931. Under the Papen-Schleicher government, the average weekly wage was reduced to 50% of what it had been in 1928 and 1929. It fell to 20.80 marks in August 1932, and since then it has fallen still further. The Finanzpolitische Korrespondenz estimates the total wage reductions of workers and employees in Germany from July 1929 to July 1932 at approximately 38 billion marks, at par about 1,900 million pounds. Together with the wage and salary reductions, there was also a tremendous rise in unemployment. According to the official figures of the Reich Ministry of Labour, unemployment rose to over 6 million. The official Trade Research Institute, however, showed that these official figures were not comprehensive, as they covered only those workers who were reporting at the labour exchanges, that in addition to the visible unemployed, there were also many invisible. On the basis of the health insurance statistics, which cover all employed persons, the invisible unemployment amounted to approximately 2 millions. While, therefore, the Ministry of Labour figures showed close on 6 million unemployed in the winter of 1931-32 and 5 million in the summer of 1932, the Institute estimated the figures at 8 million in the winter of 1931 and 32, and over 7 million in the third quarter of 1932, the best season. But even these figures did not accurately reflect the position. They did not include the hundreds of thousands of persons who had been unemployed for several years and were walking the streets of the towns as beggars or wandering through Germany as tramps, nor did they include the destitute children and the young unemployed who could find no work when they left school. They did not include the hundreds of thousands of small merchants and tradespeople, of people who had formerly been independent and professional people who were living on the verge of starvation and were in fact unemployed. The real number of unemployed at the end of 1932 must be put at somewhere round about 9 million. The position of the middle class was increasingly getting worse. The specific weight of this section of the population in Germany is considerable. According to a statistical enquiry made by Theodor Geiger, Die soziale Schichtung des deutschen Volkes, Stuttgart, 1932, the percentage proportion of the various classes in the total number of occupied persons is capitalists 0.84%, old middle class, small proprietors 18.33%, new middle class, officials, employees, etc. 16.04%, proletaroids, workers on own account, small traders, etc. 13.76%, proletariat 51.03%. The proportion of the proletariat may be put too high, but the general distribution is probably correct. The crisis brought wide sections of the middle class down into the proletariat. The number of bankruptcies rose, compulsory sales became more and more frequent. The small tradespeople of the towns and the small peasants were particularly severely hit, and the crisis hit sections of people who had hitherto not been affected, and whose position had improved during the preceding period of relative stabilization. Unemployment began to creep into the most privileged sections of intellectual workers. The standard of living of teachers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, writers, artists fell lower and lower. A quarter of the university lecturers could find no posts. Of 8,000 graduates from the technical colleges and universities in 1931-32, only 1,000 found employment in their professions. 1,500 continued their studies provisionally, suffering great privation. 1,500 found temporary work as street hawkers, waiters, etc., but 4,000 remained totally unemployed. An investigation undertaken by the Hartmann-Bund, the officially recognized doctors' association, showed that in 1932 70% of the German medical profession were earning less than 170 marks a month, at par £8 10s. 0d. The German Legal Association found that its members were in much the same position. According to a statement issued by the Prussian Minister of Education, of 22,000 teachers who completed their training in the previous year, only 990 found posts, and even these were only temporary and auxiliary teaching posts. And these figures cover Prussia only. The number of unemployed engineers and chemists increased 5 times between April 1930 and April 1932, while unemployment among technical staffs doubled and among all employees rose by 1.5 times during the same period. The position of those university lecturers who were still employed got worse from year to year. Hours were lengthened, salaries were rigorously cut. In addition, there was an increase in short-time working. Many industries worked only 3 to 5 days a week. The immense burden of reparations sharpened the crisis. The promises and hopes of the Dawes plans and the Locarno Treaty were not fulfilled. The Young Plan of 1929 made a new regulation of debts, which brought fresh opportunities for the German capitalists to transfer the burden to the workers. A new wave of radicalization passed through the workers. After the electoral success of the Social Democrats in May 1928, the working class began again to turn toward the Communist Party. Sections of the middle class, which had hitherto been indifferent to politics, now began to become active. The peasants were roused. In North Germany in 1929 they were in a state of revolt, resisting by force the bailiffs sent to rob them of their last cow. There were conflicts with the police. Then came one bomb attack after another. In Schleswig-Holstein attempts were made to blow up government offices. In 1928 a great coalition government was formed, reaching from the German People's Party, the party of heavy industry, to the Social Democrats. Hermann Müller, president of the Social Democratic Party, became chancellor. In addition to him, there were 3 Social Democrats in the government: Severing, Minister of the Interior; Hilferding, Minister of Finance; and Vinel, Minister of Labour. Stresemann, leader of the German People's Party, became Foreign Minister; his friend Dr. Curtius, Minister of Economics; and the Democrat Gessler, now a Fascist, Minister of the Reichswehr. It was under Müller's government that the Young Plan was put through. The chief delegate at the Paris Young Plan Conference was Schacht, President of the Reichsbank, who was removed from his post in 1930 and restored to it again in 1933 as a follower of Hitler. The Brüning period. In December 1929 Hilferding was removed from the government, and his place as finance minister was taken by Professor Moldenhauer, a member of the board of control of the great German chemical trust, the IG Farbenindustrie. A few months later, in March 1930, the Müller cabinet was replaced by the Brüning cabinet. The Social Democratic Party was manoeuvred out of the government. Nevertheless, the Brüning-Grüne Stegerwald government, which did not have a majority in the Reichstag, was willingly supported and tolerated by the Social Democrats. At the same time, this government was already thinking of bringing in the National Socialists. In the Gericke trial in June 1933, the former minister Treviranus explicitly stated that at that time Brüning had the intention of bringing in the Nazis. The Social Democrats represented to the workers that the Brüning government was a lesser evil than a government which was purely Fascist and capitalist. The Social Democratic Prussian government of Braun and Severing firmly supported the Brüning government of the Reich. The period of democracy came to an end amid the difficulties which the economic crisis brought to Germany's financial, industrial and agrarian capitalists. Brüning ruled Germany with Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which in fact suspends the Constitution. But it was not the first time that the rulers of the German Republic had had to correct a political development which was beginning to get dangerous by the introduction of the state of siege and the suspension of democratic rights. During the years 1919 to 1923, when the Social Democrat Ebert was president of the Reich, Article 48 made it possible to prohibit strikes in so-called vital industries, to organize strike-breaking corps for technical assistance in emergencies, to send the Reichswehr to Saxony and Thuringia in 1923, to restore constitutional conditions, and to appoint General von Seeckt as military dictator for the prohibition of the German Communist Party. Zürtgiebel, the Social Democratic police president of Berlin and a former trade union leader, prohibited the working-class demonstrations of May 1st, 1929, and when the workers broke through this prohibition and demonstrated, he sent police against them, killing 33 Berlin workers. A few days later, Severing prohibited the Red Front organization, which was the anti-fascist defense organization of the revolutionary workers, while in Prussia the Nazis were allowed to continue legally building up their fighting organizations. The Reichstag was sidetracked by Brüning. The Social Democrats gave their consent to this, and Brüning ruled with emergency decrees on the basis of Article 48 of the Constitution. He decreed the reduction of unemployment payments, the lowering of the miserable pensions of the victims of the war, of the sick, of old people, widows and orphans. He decreed new taxes on the masses, the poll tax, the crisis tax, the bachelor's tax. He decreed increases in import duties and thereby increases in the price of food. He put an end to the rent protection legislation. Banks and industrial concerns received millions in subsidies. The great landlords were able to put themselves right at the expense of their workers. They received millions out of the so-called Aid for the East. And the police presidents, of whom more than half were members of the Social Democratic Party, put down with intense severity the defensive movements of the workers, prohibited the communist press, and forbade working-class demonstrations. Through this policy the Social Democrats not only actually helped forward the development of the reactionary and fascist forces in Germany, but also gave the National Socialists the pretext for their demagogic campaign against the failure of the Marxist system. The Social Democrats tolerated the Brüning government, which increased the burdens of the workers until they became intolerable, and ruled by dictatorial methods, preparing the way for the summoning of the National Socialists to government power. During this period the second revival of the National Socialist Party began. Together with Hugenberg, the spokesman of the reactionary wing of German heavy industry and of the landlords, with the support of the Stahlhelm and other nationalist organisations, the National Socialists demanded a referendum against the Young Plan. It was conveniently forgotten that in 1925 Hugenberg's German National People's Party had set aside one half of their fraction in the Reichstag to help to secure the acceptance of the Dawes Plan. The gigantic propaganda apparatus of the Hugenberg concern, with its hundreds of newspapers and its telegraph agency, the Telegraphen Union (TU), was now at the service of the National Socialists. The referendum came to nothing, but the National Socialists could record definite successes in the elections for the Diets of Saxony and Thuringia, and in the Prussian local elections. In 1930 Frick became Minister of the Interior and of Education in Thuringia, the first National Socialist minister in Germany. In Thuringia they joined a coalition with all the parties of the right, including the German People's Party, which at that time was in the Reich coalition with the Social Democrats. Only a year earlier Goebbels, in his small ABC of National Socialism, had called the German People's Party a representative of the interests of big capital. Hitler shows his true colours. One section of the Socialists in the Nazi Party, under the leadership of Otto Strasser, considered that they could no longer follow the legal tactics then used, and in May 1930 left the party under the slogan, "The Socialists leave the National Socialist Party." Before this Strasser had a long discussion with Hitler, who told him, "The great mass of the workers wants nothing more than bread and circuses. It has no comprehension of any ideals, and we shall never be able to count on ideals to win the workers in large numbers. We want a selection from the new master class, who are not guided, as you are, by a morality of sympathy." Strasser asked Hitler, "If you took power tomorrow, what would you do the day after, for example, with the Krupp concern? Will everything remain just as it is now for the shareholders and the workers in regard to ownership, profits and management?" Hitler replied, "But of course. Do you imagine I am so crazy as to destroy trade? The state would only step in when people were not acting in the interests of the nation, but for this no expropriation is necessary, nor any joint share and control, but the power of the strong state, which alone is in the position to let itself be governed entirely by wide viewpoints, without consideration of individuals. The expression socialism is in itself bad, but above all it does not mean that these concerns must be socialized, but only that they can be socialized if they conflict with the interests of the nation. So long as they do not do this, it would be simply a crime to interfere with trade. In this connection we have a precedent which we can adopt without further question, namely Italian Fascism. Just as the Fascists have already put this into effect, in our National Socialist state also employers and workers will stand alongside each other with equal rights, while the decision in disputes is left to the state, which takes care that economic struggles do not endanger the life of the nation. With this guarantee to the capitalist economic system, Hitler once again recommended himself to the ruling groups of German finance capital. He showed them that, as in the case of the Italian Fascist programme, so the nationalist economic programme only aimed at guaranteeing the reconsolidation of capitalism. He has kept the promises which he then gave. The Reichstag elections of September 1930 gave the National Socialists their first great electoral success. They secured 6,400,000 votes and 107 seats, becoming the second strongest party after the Social Democrats. The Communists won 600,000 votes. The German Nationalist Party lost half their seats. The German People's Party won third. The National Socialists owed their success to propaganda aimed at winning the radicalized middle-class elements. This propaganda offered unlimited promises to all sections, and it was conducted with gigantic resources supplied by capitalist donors. The Nazis promised the workers higher wages, the employers higher profits, the tenants lower rents, the house owners higher rents, the peasants higher prices, the middle class cheaper food. But they did not succeed in effecting any real penetration of the working class. They merely attracted large sections of former voters for the capitalist parties. Should Hitler be Chancellor of the Reich? Brüning continued in office and issued new emergency decrees. The Social Democrats supported him in carrying through this policy. And with the growth of the National Socialist Party, the question of openly calling it to power became more and more frequently raised. In April of 1932, Hindenburg was elected a second time as President of the Reich, with the votes of the Social Democrats, who issued the slogan, "A vote for Hindenburg is a blow at Hitler." In May 1932, at the instigation of the East Prussian Junkers, Chancellor Brüning was overthrown, and a Pappenschleicher government took his place. The new government started to bring in even more severe dictatorial measures. On July 20th, 1932, Papen was appointed Reich Commissioner for Prussia. A captain with 3 soldiers of the Reichswehr sufficed to break the resistance of the Social Democratic ministers of Prussia. For a short time, martial law was in force in the Berlin-Brandenburg area. The Social Democratic leaders offered no resistance, although they still had under their control the whole of the police in Prussia and in several of the other states of the Reich, and although the Social Democrat police officers were urging armed resistance. On the contrary, the Social Democrat leaders denounced the Communists, who were calling on the workers for a general strike, as provocateurs. They weakened the working class forces and abandoned their positions in order to be able, as they thought, to save at least something from the wreck, and so the Prussian home of democracy fell into the hands of the reactionaries without a struggle. In August 1932, after a second electoral success for the Nazis, 13.5 million votes and 225 seats in the Reichstag, the appointment of Hitler as Chancellor began to be discussed. Hindenburg still hesitated, but the demand for Hitler's appointment grew more insistent. The Deutsche Führerbriefe, a private bulletin of the Union of German Industry, published an article which disclosed the plans of the dominant capitalist groups under the title "The Social Reconsolidation of Capitalism." It contained the following passages: "The problem of consolidating the capitalist regime in post-war Germany is governed by the fact that the leading section, that is, the capitalists controlling industry, has become too small to maintain its rule alone. Unless recourse is to be had to the extremely dangerous weapon of purely military force, it is necessary for it to link itself with sections which do not belong to it from a social standpoint, but which can render it the essential service of anchoring its rule among the people, and thereby becoming its especial or last defender." This last or outermost defender of bourgeois rule in the first period after the war was Social Democracy. National Socialism has to succeed Social Democracy in providing a mass support for capitalist rule in Germany. Social Democracy had a special qualification for this task, which up to the present National Socialism lacks. Thanks to its character as the original party of the workers, Social Democracy, in addition to its purely political force, also had the much more valuable and permanent advantage of control over organized labour, and by paralysing its revolutionary energies chained it firmly to the capitalist state. In the first period of reconsolidation of the capitalist regime after the war, the working class was divided by the wages victories and social political measures through which the Social Democrats canalized the revolutionary movement. The deflection of the revolution into social-political measures corresponded with the transference of the struggle from the factories and the streets into Parliament and cabinets, that is, with the transformation of the struggle from below into concessions from above. From then onwards, therefore, the social democratic and trade union bureaucracy, and with them also the section of the workers whom they led, were closely tied to the capitalist state, and participation in its administration, at least so long as there was anything left of their post-war victories to defend by these means, and so long as the workers followed their leadership. This analysis leads to 4 important conclusions. 1. The policy of the lesser evil is not merely tactical, it is the political essence of social democracy. 2. The cords which bind the trade union bureaucracy to the state method from above are more compelling than those which bind them to Marxism, and therefore to social democracy, and this holds in relation to the bourgeois state, which wants to draw in this bureaucracy. 3. The links between the trade union bureaucracy and social democracy stand or fall from a political standpoint with parliamentarianism. 4. The possibility of a liberal social policy for monopoly capitalism is conditioned by the existence of an automatic mechanism for the creation of divisions in the working class. A capitalist regime which adopts a liberal social policy must not only be entirely parliamentary, it must also be based on social democracy, and must allow social democracy to have sufficient gains to record. A capitalist regime which puts an end to these gains must also sacrifice parliamentarism and social democracy, must create a substitute for social democracy, and pass over to a social policy of constraint. The process of this transition in which we are at the moment, for the reason that the economic crisis has perforce blotted out the gains referred to, has to pass through the acutely dangerous stage when, with the wiping out of these gains, the mechanism for the creation of divisions in the working class, which depended on them, also ceases to function, the working class moves in the direction of communism, and the capitalist rule approaches the emergency stage of military dictatorship. The only safeguard from this acute stage is if the division and holding back of the working class, which the former mechanism can no longer adequately maintain, is carried out by other and more direct methods. In this lies the positive opportunities and tasks of National Socialism. If National Socialism succeeds in bringing the trade unions into a social policy of constraint, as social democracy formerly succeeded in bringing them into a liberal policy, then National Socialism would become the bearer of one of the functions essential to the future of capitalist rule, and must necessarily find its place in the state and social system. The danger of a state capitalist or even socialist development, which is often urged against, such as incorporation of the trade unions under National Socialist leadership, will in effect be avoided precisely by these means. There is no third course between a reconsolidation of capitalist rule and the communist revolution. These paragraphs give the key to an understanding of the political situation. The Papenschleicher period. The Papenschleicher government was a further stage on the road to a Hitler dictatorship. Its emergency decrees were models for Hitler to follow: the death penalty for high treason, the death penalty for political acts of violence, the establishment of emergency courts which imposed long sentences of imprisonment for minor offences. But this government of big capitalists, Junkers and generals, had no mass following. The Stahlhelm and the German National People's Party were entirely inadequate. Papen's much advertised economic programme of September 1932 laid new burdens on the workers and gave new millions to the rich. Powerful anti-fascist demonstrations under the leadership of the Communist Party, which was carrying on the only serious extra-parliamentary fight against Fascism, were broken up. These reached their highest point in the Berlin traffic strike of November 1932, which demonstrated the helplessness of the government in face of the determination of the workers. At this period, too, National Socialism was passing through a serious crisis. In the November elections it lost almost 2 million votes. The total vote for the Communist Party reached 6 millions. At the end of November, Papen fell, and Schleicher succeeded him early in December. Behind the scenes, negotiations were carried on in one direction with the trade unions, and also with a view to the drawing in of Hitler. No government can sit on bayonets. Schleicher hesitated, did nothing, and merely modified some of Papen's emergency decrees. On January 22nd, the National Socialists staged a provocative demonstration in front of the Communist Party headquarters, the Karl Liebknecht House. General Schleicher sent the whole police force to protect the Nazis from the workers' counter-demonstrations. The situation grew more and more acute. General Schleicher was considering the immediate proclamation of a military dictatorship. Papen worked against Schleicher's plan by negotiating with Hitler and Hugenberg. At last, the ruling groups of Germany, as the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung put it, tried a leap in the dark. On January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg, the candidate for the presidency, who had been supported by the Social Democrats, appointed Hitler Chancellor of the German Reich. End of chapter 1, part 2.